So in this video, we're going to cover some basics of supply and demand. So it's predominantly just a review. We're setting this up so that we can use these basic tools to show how free trade can increase welfare in a society. So first step is to review some basics with supply and demand equations and supply and demand curves, look at equilibrium and whatnot. And then we're going to move on to talking about the concepts of consumer surplus and producer surplus, because that is what we're going to use when we're looking at changes in welfare. Right? So even just from this basic idea of what happens to total welfare in a given market when we open up to trade, and then in subsequent chapters when we look at interventions in markets such as tariffs and quotas. So these are the basics that we need that we'll make use of, not just in this chapter, but in subsequent chapters. So here what we already have up on the board is a demand function. Right? So demand in the home market, right? Think about it, say it's the US, is given by 90,000 minus 25p, and supply is given by 25p minus 10,000. Now what we would like to do is to plot these equations, right, as our supply and demand curves. But of course, if you remember from principles classes, we plot price against quantity. And so in order to do that, we need to invert these two equations. So in other words, we need to bring that 25p over here to the left. And so you can imagine adding, right, 25p here, bringing the quantity demanded over to the right, and then dividing through by 25. So what that gives us is p equals, and so now you're dividing 90,000 by 25, and that's going to give us 3,600 minus, and so here you can write it either of two ways. You can either write it as 1 over 25p, or we can put it as a decimal. And I'm going to stick with what our textbook does just for consistency, but in terms of in class, I don't care which way you do it. Whatever you're more comfortable with, stick with that. So now, right, this is we've inverted our demand function so that it is price is a function of quantity. Okay? And again, so this is the quantity demanded. And now we can take that function there, and then we can plot that into our space here. Okay? And so here we have our demand curve. And so you can imagine if you set your quantity demanded to 0, that's what puts you then on the y-intercept, right? A quantity demanded of 0 is right here. And at that quantity, what would your price be? Well, it would be 3,600, right? 3,600. So your demand curve starts at 3,600, downward sloping. We'll do the same thing with our supply function, right? We have 25p minus 10,000. So again, now you're going to, in this case, it's actually the easiest thing is just to bring the 10,000 over. And so now you've got, and then divide through and by 25, just because that's what we have a 25 here again. So you have P equals 0.04 QS plus, right, that 10,000 divided by 25, which gives us 400. Okay? So again, we're going to take this inverted now supply function, and we're going to plot that here in our graph. So again, if you set QS equals to 0, that's going to give you the y, or the price intercept. And we see that that's at 400. And that's our supply curve. Now, of course, we also would like to find our equilibrium just to have as a starting point. Because if we take right, this is our domestic supply and demand. Right? So imagine we're starting off in a world where there's no free trade. Right? So the domestic equilibrium is given where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. In other words, it is where, and I'll go ahead and start with, it doesn't matter whether you take the demand and supply function or the inverted functions. Either way, you'll get the same answer. So I'll just go ahead and start with these because they're just a little easier to work with. I'm not working with all those decimals. All right, so if I'll bring this 25 minus 25p here over to the right, that makes that 50p. Add 10,000 to both sides to move this minus 10,000 over to the left. Now I'm going to divide through by 50 to solve. And that tells me that p is equal to 2,000. All right, and so that is our equilibrium here, 2,000. Okay. And then I can take that price, plug that back into either equation, right? And I should get the same answer. So if you plug it into either the supply or the demand function, you will find that quantity is equal to 40. So I am skipping a few steps here, but I expect that you should be able to do these few steps of arithmetic at this point. Okay? So this gives us the domestic equilibrium. Okay? Now, before we move on to showing how you get the export or either export supply or import demand function, depending on whether this country is an importer or an exporter, we need to review the basic concepts of consumer and producer surplus. Okay? So if you remember, consumer surplus, and you should have covered this in your Principles of Micro class. Consumer surplus is the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay and what they actually have to pay for the product. Okay? And where do we find that willingness to pay? Well, that's given by the demand curve. Okay? So any point on the demand curve gives us that willingness to pay. Okay? So like let's say this is at 20. Right? Here is your willingness to pay. Actually, we're going to work with that as being 15. Okay. So what's going on here at 15? So here's our willingness to pay. But if the equilibrium price is 2,000, right, you can see that there's this big difference between what the consumer is willing to pay and what they actually paid. Okay? So we refer to that as our consumer surplus. Okay? And we're just, the units of measurement here are just dollars. Okay? Likewise, right, producer surplus is the difference between the lowest price that the producer is willing to accept in order to sell that unit of the good and the price that they actually receive. Right? Well, what is the lowest price the producer is willing to receive or to accept? That's given by the supply curve. Right? So at 15, that's this amount here. But they actually receive 2,000, right? In equilibrium, for this 15th unit of the good, the seller is receiving more than the minimum needed to get that producer to sell, right, to produce and sell that unit of the good. So that's the producer surplus from just that 15th unit. Right, so what is if you think about it, right, that's just from the 15th unit. You can do this for every unit of the good. So what we have is these two areas here. And you have your consumer surplus, which is the area below the demand curve. Down to the equilibrium price, and all the way out to the quantity that's supplied. Right? So this upper triangle here is our consumer surplus, and then this lower triangle here is our producer surplus. The total surplus in the market is the sum of the two. Now, it's important here to pause and think about what the underlying assumption there is. Right? We're saying total surplus is just you add the consumer surplus to the producer surplus. Well, implicitly what we're doing is we're weighting consumer and producer surplus equally, right? A dollar of consumer surplus counts the same as a dollar of producer surplus. Okay? Now, some people don't like that way of looking at things. Some people want to give more priority, say, to consumers. But the reason we do this is because we're just looking at the total surplus that's available. Ultimately, you can, through different policy measures, try to transfer surplus from one group to another. And in fact, in a subsequent chapter, what we are going to see is that it's exactly what happens with trade policy. Okay? So just bear in mind that we treat a dollar of consumer surplus as equal to a dollar of producer surplus. Okay? They're equivalent in terms of the welfare implications. So the last thing we're going to do in this video is just show how we get in this case, we're going to assume that this country has a high price, and we'll show that later when we put the export supply and import demand curves together, right? We're going to assume that this $2,000 equilibrium price is higher than what happens in the rest of the world. It's higher than the price in the rest of the world, which means, right, if you have a high price, when you open up the trade, you will be an importer. Okay? So right, the graph on the right is the domestic market, and here this is the world or international market. Okay. And what are we seeing here is, so the domestic equilibrium, or what we call the autarky equilibrium, right, the equilibrium with no international trade, is at 2,000. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the home country, consumers there are only going to start to buy foreign goods if the price is below that. And if the price was above 2,000, you'd actually be an exporter. So the import demand curve starts at 2,000 and is downward sloping from there. Okay? And likewise, you can do the same thing if we had the other country, which for the sake of our example in the second video, we're just going to refer to, as the book does, as rest of the world, rho. You take the supply and demand for rho, rest of the world, find the equilibrium there, and then from that combination of those two functions, you can derive the export supply function, right, in the curve, and then put it all together in our world market. And that's what we will do in the next video.